Why, never. Do you know how paper's made? Imagine Spindleshanks is a tree. You chop him down, pulp him, strain him, and hang him out to dry. Isn't it amazing what you can learn from a spider? I call this tale Goblin Mountain. Joe Alexander lived in the shadow of a huge mountain. He was always reading frightening stories about this mountain. Books about a giant eagle that plucked wicked children from their beds, about lost souls that wailed in the trees, about goblins who dined on the sweet, tender flesh of young humans. Joe treated the mountain with all the respect that these books demanded. He never went near it. But, in spite of his fear, Joe was a thoughtless vandal. When he'd finished a book, he would rip out the pages and hurl them out of the window. He loved the way they fluttered across the garden like large white butterflies. "What are you doing?" shouted his father. "Books should be respected." "I'm planting new books," said Joe, "by scattering the pages across the mountainside." Soon, the day arrived when there were no books left in the house. "Into the attic," ordered his father, "until you can apologise." "For what?" "For destroying those books and losing their stories forever." Upstairs. The attic was dark and spooky, and Joe was cross. On the other hand, maybe he could just open that skylight and escape across the roof. He found an old trunk to stand on, but it was too heavy to move. "Must be a dead body inside," he joked nervously as he opened the lid. The trunk was empty, save for a large black book covered in cobwebs. Inside, it was full of meaningless symbols, but the pictures were horribly familiar. Ugly faces, twisted bodies, evil bulbous eyes. Goblins! Joe was hooked. This was an ancient book full of weird magic spells. Each page wove its magic fingers around him and forced him to read on until he had finished. You can guess what happened next. Joe was spellbound as the white pages floated across the garden like a flock of doves. But as they reached the mountain, they burst into flames, and out of each flame sprung a screeching black crow. The spell was broken, and Joe was afraid. The cover of the book was red hot. With a scream, he hurled it out the window, but it landed in a tree that burst into flames and burnt to a smoking stump, on top of which sat a giant eagle. Joe's mother heard his scream. As she burst into the attic, she was knocked backwards by a fierce gust of wind. A giant eagle's feather settled beside her, and when she looked up, Joe! Her son was disappearing through the skylight. The eagle lost interest in Joe as it circled its nest. If it hadn't been for the trees, he would surely have fallen to his death. "Beware," said a whispering voice. "Beware." Joe spun round to see who it was, but there was no one there. "Beware," Or was it the tree talking?
Beware of what?
But the wind did not reply. Joe had landed on a ledge by the entrance to a cave. He crawled inside lest the eagle should return for an early supper. The cave sweated a nauseating stench of rotten meat.
Goblins!
Joe gasped with horror.
But they only exist in storybooks. They aren't real.
Oh, yes, we are,
said a voice behind him.
and now you're coming with me.
The goblin chained Joe's neck and dragged him into a cavern full of screeching black crows and stinking, chattering goblins. They poked him with sticks and pinched his legs and breathed their foul breath all over him. There were 3 loud knocks, and the cave fell silent as a white-haired goblin entered the chamber.
Let the trial commence,
He bellowed, and the goblin court came to order.
You are accused, Joe Alexander, of willfully destroying the great Book of Thog, containing the mystical ancient secrets of this magic mountain. All rise while I pass sentence.
Excuse me, but don't I get a chance to say a few words in my defense?
No, said the judge. That is not the goblin way. The crowd roared their approval.
Chop off his head, drown him in a vat of goose fat.
But I promise I'll never do it again.
Don't believe you. Guilty! Take him away and plant him with the others.
What do you mean, plant me?
You are to be turned into a tree, just like all the other children who think it's acceptable to tear up their books. One day you will be chopped down to make paper. One day you will be stuck together to make a book. One day you will be torn to shreds by some other miserable child.
The goblins dug a deep hole in the forest and threw Joe in.
I told you to beware,
Whispered a voice that Joe had heard before. So it had been a tree. It was the voice of another child planted beside him. But I didn't understand you, cried Joe. I didn't know. I didn't know. I didn't know. You didn't know what? Joe's mother had finally managed to open the door to the attic. You've been screaming your head off for the last 10 minutes, she said. Joe threw his arms around her. It was all a dream. I promise I'll never tear up another book in my whole life. I don't want to be a tree. I'm sure you don't, said his mother as she hugged him back. Then she took Joe downstairs to bed. And as she did so, an icy wind gusted in through the open window, picked up the giant eagle's feather and blew it out across the garden towards Goblin Mountain. Would you like to meet Joe? I'm afraid he's rather heavy these days and working undercover. And this is what I made out of spindle shanks. So, not entirely wasted then.